Thank you very much, Principal, for your kind introduction. One of the things I've noticed since I stepped down from government in 2010 is how nice people are about you. I'm also absolutely certain you're not coming back. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to ladies and gentlemen for coming to this talk this afternoon. As the Principal just said, in just under 100 days, each and every one of us who's in the electoral role will take what I think is the biggest political decision of our lifetime. We will decide on the future of our country. And we'll make a choice which will determine not just our future, but the future of our children and grandchildren and the generations to come. This is not like a general election where you vote in one lot and you don't like them 4 years or 5 years later, you can vote in the next lot. This is a choice that we make, and if we decide to leave the UK, it is a choice that we will make forever. There is no going back. And the big question before us is, should we set off on our own as a separate independent state, or should we renew our commitment to the partnership of the United Kingdom? Now, I believe that the right answer, the Scottish answer, to this question is that Scotland would choose to remain part of a renewed union with the rest of the UK, because I believe that that is a choice that would be good for Scotland and for the UK, and it is the right thing to do. So in this short talk, I want to set out the positive view that I hold as to why it is best for Scotland and the UK that we reject the risks and the uncertainties of independence, but rather remain part of the UK. Now, my starting point is an understanding of Scotland's place within that United Kingdom. The union which Scotland entered over 300 years ago has always had a distinct Scottish identity and special Scottish institutions. Scotland was never absorbed into England and never became Northern Britain. Remember, what mattered to most Scots in the 17th and 18th centuries was religious identity. And it was not the medieval Scottish Parliament, which few had a voice. What they regarded as being more important was the Scottish Church, in which many had a place. But England and Scotland had almost just fought themselves to a standstill over religious differences. They concluded that neither could impose its state religion on the other, and so the Union preserved two different churches. And at a time when the power of the state was concentrated in the courts and the legal system, the Union of 1707 preserved Scotland's separate and very distinct laws and court system. The Scots negotiators understood exactly what they were doing in 1707. They faced two unpalatable choices: complete independence, which was unsustainable for economic or military reasons, or absorption into England, which of course was rightly unacceptable. The union they negotiated was what some now call the best of both worlds. The union may have merged parliaments, but it never did merge Scotland into England. Instead, Scotland retained its own institutions, and over the decades and centuries that followed, that has evolved. As the state grew, so did the Scottish governmental bodies, commissions, boards and departments, dealing with everything from agricultural improvement to education. And as a result, by the end of the last century, the Scottish Office, as it then was, ran a great deal of domestic policy in Scotland. But of course it had one big defect, one shortcoming: it wasn't democratically accountable to Scotland, and that's what led us to set up the Scottish Parliament in 1999. So I think when we understand the history properly, we see that it gives an alternative vision to the sometimes romantic view that somehow our small nation was absorbed into a larger neighbour and struggled to retain its identity through the efforts of a small band of people. This simply isn't right. Now, I'm proud to have played my part in the creation of the Scottish Parliament as a minister, sustaining devolution during its early years. But we never thought that the legislation in 1998 made our constitutional arrangements complete. That's why 10 years later we had the Calman Commission, which led to new powers for the Scottish Parliament, which are now in the 2012 Scotland Act. That's why those powers will be extended further if people vote to remain in the UK, as each of the main UK parties have now committed to the further development of powers for the Scottish Parliament. In other words, the process is not yet complete. But Scotland's place in the UK is not just about devolution. Perhaps the most significant contribution that the Calman Commission made was to analyse not just the power that the Scottish Parliament had, but also Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK, the Union, and it's to that I want to turn. Because they saw the Union as a political one, yes, in which the Scottish Parliament played a very significant part. But the Union was also economic, bringing benefits to the whole country. And it also is a social union, the solidarity of pooling and sharing resources to guarantee social provision all across the country. And it's when you look at these aspects of the Union as a whole, we see very clearly why it is in Scotland's interest to remain as part of the United Kingdom. First, if you look at the economic case, economic questions are, of course, in the front of most voters' minds, and maybe that's not surprising at this time when we're still emerging from the deep downturn. There's still economic uncertainty after what was a very long and deep recession. The economic case for remaining in the UK is, to me, unanswerable. In essence, it's being part of a wider market, a larger economy, with a deeper pool of resources which brings opportunity, security and stability. Being part of an integrated UK economy allows Scotland to share opportunities, but it also allows us to deal with risks too. Scotland has been part of a deep economic union for so long that we almost take it for granted. It's actually quite hard to imagine a world where Scots couldn't move with complete freedom to take up jobs elsewhere in the UK and vice versa. We assume without question that Scottish businesses can buy and sell on the market and open so that the border between Scotland and England simply doesn't matter. We take for granted that businesses can secure capital to expand any financial institution in the UK regardless of the effect of a border. But it wasn't always so. Securing access to the English markets was a Scottish objective as long ago as 1700. At its heart, the economic union is about free trade and movement of goods and services, people and capital, resources without hindrance across borders to all parts of the country. That is so important to us. Now, I wouldn't argue that free trade is the answer to all our economic and social problems, but in the right circumstances, it can benefit buyers and sellers equally. I don't have to labour this point at a university like this, but it's an important one. And of course, it's worked for us as Scots. After the Union, once the Jacobite Wars were over, Scotland's trade multiplied and its industry grew. As Adam Smith said in 1760, the Union is a measure from which infinite good had been derived to this country. And it isn't an exaggeration to say that the breakneck speed of the development of Scottish industry and commercial development of the late 19th century and the fruits that followed it allowed Scotland, as the American author Arthur Herman said, to create the modern world. And still today, this open market is hugely important to Scotland. Our businesses have a much larger market than Scotland alone. Scotland's domestic market is 60 million people, 10 times that of our population. And it's a market that Scottish businesses can sell and buy from without any impediment whatsoever. Now, that matters, especially to young people who will be looking for jobs in the future. So today, Scotland trades more with the rest of the UK than the rest of the world combined. It's a fact that we actually sell more goods to Yorkshire than we do to the United States. We sell more to Essex than we do to Germany. And many hundreds of thousands of Scottish jobs depend on these trading partnerships. Now, these are the Scots whose businesses have customers in England, Scots whose companies based there, and splitting the two countries, Scotland and the rest of the UK, can only damage that. If you look at our industries in finance, the creative industries, in manufacturing, they benefit and thrive because of the links with the rest of the UK, not despite them. Now at this point, our opponents, the nationalists, will say, well, independence wouldn't change anything because you'll still be in a single market. And they point to the European single market as an example. But that's not the same thing. The single market you have in the rest of Europe is not the complete open market that we have in the UK at the present time. For example, in pensions, there is very little cross-border trade simply because of the different regulatory and tax regimes. And all the evidence is that international borders do affect trade. There are differences in taxation, currency, regulation, and ultimately, it affects a sense of belonging too. That's why, even though the United States of America and Canada are in a free trade area, Canadian provinces are more likely to trade with each other than across the borders with the American state. And that's why, of course, international organisations spend so much time and effort reducing not just tariff and non-tariff barriers, because they want to see that trade expand. And if Scotland, of course, remains in the UK, those barriers would not exist. It's a result of this that Scotland's done well economically inside the UK. In fact, since records were begun in 1963, our per capita economic growth has exceeded that of the UK as a whole. And as a result, Scotland is the third fastest growing part of the UK, only behind the South East and London. And whether you measure it by gross domestic product or household income, we have benefited from this union. We do this, of course, by specialising in what we're best at. I could refer to shipbuilding, as Scotland now builds all the UK's warships, or to the financial services industry, and despite the difficulties of 6 or 7 years ago, 200,000 jobs in Scotland depend on that industry, and 90% of their customers live elsewhere in the UK. And these sectors would be particularly vulnerable to creating a border. Borders matter hugely for a regulated sector like financial services because of different tax and prudential rules. They matter for people who build warships. The UK hasn't built one abroad for a long time, except during wartime. But perhaps I should refer particularly today to something else that Scotland has excelled at, and that's university teaching and research. Scotland's universities, including this one, are indeed world class, and it's a great pleasure to be in one of them today. Of course, we had 4 universities for a long time when England struggled by with 2, so we've got a good track record there. But we now have 4 universities in the world's 200, that's more than France, including this one. Our world-leading universities educate young people from across the UK. They're especially successful in Scotland attracting research funding, and the Common UK Research Framework allows Scotland to attract over 13% of competitively awarded Research Council funding, even though we've only got 8% of the UK's population. Now, why put that at risk? In addition to that, we've got funding from charities and other organisations which feed into Scotland simply because there are no barriers and boundaries between us. And it's perfectly plain that the idea with independence that you could have free university education for Scots but charge students from England simply is legally unsustainable. It just wouldn't happen. And that again raises questions as to how Scottish university funding would exist. And these universities are all hugely important to the Scottish economy. They contribute around £6.5 billion. And in addition to that, of course, they generate the innovation and the research that's likely to lead to the new industries and jobs in the future. So these are the benefits the Union brings to Scotland, and there's no reason to put them at risk. And no more is that more clear than in relation to the shared currency, the pound sterling. Currency union is a real sign of economic union, and currency union works for Scotland because it's backed up by a fiscal and a banking union and a political union. And not only does that bring opportunities, it also helps us manage risks. As Chancellor of the Exchequer during the banking crisis in 2008, I'm perhaps more aware of this than many. I'm sometimes asked by people, which of your 1,000 days in Downing Street is the worst? And the short answer is I'm somewhat spoiled for choice as far as that's concerned. But if I had to choose, I'd choose the morning of the 7th of October 2008, when I was called by the then chairman of RBS, and on that day money was pouring out of what was then the largest bank in the world. Now, of course, we had a rescue plan ready to go. And I said to Sir Dr. Philip, I said, we've got this plan. I said, how long can you last? And he said, well, maybe 2 or 3 hours. Now, if that bank had gone down, the cash machines would have gone off, the drawers would have shut, it would have brought down not just Britain's banking system, but that of America and Europe as well. So the advantage that I had then is because I was Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United Kingdom, whose GDP, its wealth, was just about equivalent to the total worth of RBS on that day, I could do something about it. My Irish counterpart, faced with 3 collapsing banks on the other side of the Irish Sea, wasn't so lucky. I remember speaking to him that day and asked him, how on earth can you say you've guaranteed the 3 Irish banks and they're much bigger than the Irish state? Fortunately, he had a sense of humour and he said, well, I hope no one finds out. They did, and you would have seen what happened to that particular branch of the Ark of Prosperity. Huge difficulty because they simply couldn't afford to do it. Now, on its own, Scotland couldn't have done this because its banking sector is 12 times the size of our GDP. By way of comparison, Cyprus sits at near 9%. So the advantage of being part of something bigger means you can manage risks much more easily than otherwise. And if we were on our own, a currency union, I don't believe would work for us, because there wouldn't be that fiscal union to back it up, or the banking union. and it simply wouldn't work as you see in the Eurozone. We'd be economically dependent on the rest of the UK, but unrepresented in decision-making. Now, this can at times seem like dry economic theory, but it actually matters to people because this is what will depend on our ability to generate jobs now and in the future, and to generate the opportunities that we want to see from generations to come. But there is much more to this argument than an economic one. There's a social one too, because a union based only on an economic interest might be sustained, but would struggle to attract much loyalty or affection. But Scotland is part of a union which is a wider dimension merely than trade and commerce. We pool not just economic risks. The UK's welfare state is an important part of what this country is. The NHS is perhaps the finest example of that. We take it for granted that we contribute to resources and to a common pool, but we also benefit when these resources are needed. And perhaps the most significant of these is the old age pension, introduced actually by a Welsh Liberal 100 years ago, but integrated into our wider system of national insurance and social security by an English minister some years later. And we know that if you're out of work in Glasgow, your benefits are often partly contributed to by someone who's working in Glamorgan. When you retire in Lanark, your pension is being paid by perhaps somebody working in Liverpool. The point is that our welfare state ensures that resources go to those who need them, paid by those who can afford them. And that applies at an individual level, but it also applies to the nations of the United Kingdom too. Because we have contributed to the development and funding of the welfare state, and we've taken great security from it. And very few people want to break that up. Indeed, many, including myself, would like to strengthen it. The sharing of resources, in my view, is morally right, and those who can afford to, and those parts of the country that have done particularly well, contribute to those in need, or those areas of need, they benefit. Creations and economic growth, as well as giving us stability and security, something we see the lack of in the Eurozone today. And as well as pooling our resources, we are also sharing risks. And these might be risks of economic change or risks like the gradual decline of North Sea oil revenues and the volatility of the tax income that comes from it. Just last year, the revenue from North Sea oil fell by about £4.5 billion. That's roughly equivalent to what we spend on the schools budget. But because the resources are shared across the whole of the UK, actually spending in Scotland actually grew because of the way the Barnett formula works. There's more spending at a higher level per head population here than it is in England. So looking ahead in the long run, pooling risks and resources is prudent as well as is principled. And we know that in the long run, the projections are that Scotland's need for public spending, particularly in relation to pensions, will continue to grow, whilst at the same time, our working age population here is due to shrink, with the result that the burden that we will face will be greater than the rest of the UK. And my argument is quite simple. Why take that burden on the shoulders of 5 million people rather than the over 60 million people living in the UK? It is all part of a principle of pooling and sharing resources. And it's overwhelmingly, in my view, in Scotland's interest to keep doing that as we did in the past, particularly as we see revenues from the North Sea oil field begin to fall. And that takes me, I think, to the political union. I began about talking about Scotland's position in the UK. We have the benefit of being part of a larger state, and through devolution, the opportunities of a smaller one. We remain one of the world's biggest economies and a significant player in world affairs. We still sit on the UN Security Council and at the top table of the European Union, and that matters. In 13 years I attended ministerial councils of Europe. I can tell you it is the large countries that call the shots in Europe. It's not small countries. I imagine they think that wrong, but actually that's how it works. It's a deeply political organisation. And many decisions are taken there, not just on farming and fishing, but right across the piece that affect our livelihoods in this country. And being one of the biggest countries in the European Union and one of the most influential works in Scotland's interest. Now, of course, we could go it alone as a small state, and no doubt Scotland would be much respected. But the bottom line is you don't have the same clout or influence. But the particular way the UK is organised does mean that we can have these advantages while still running our domestic affairs from a Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. And that Parliament already has a wide range of powers, and it has a responsibility for a large proportion of public spending in a state where you see the most decentralised powers in federal governments. Virtually all Scottish domestic policy, apart from those things like old age pensions, which are best secured at a UK level, are now dealt with in Edinburgh. But what the Parliament has lacked so far is enough taxpayers to make it directly responsible for raising money and accountable, as well as having the ability to spend money. And if we vote in the UK, that is guaranteed to change. All three political parties which support us staying in the UK have said that they want to increase the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament in relation to tax raising and in other matters as well. Today they've made that clear, that will be in their manifestos with legislation following in the general election next spring. So this process is one that is continuing. The choice in September isn't between the status quo and change. It is change within the UK where we can have the best of both worlds, a strong Scottish Parliament, and at the same time remaining something bigger. So not only would Scotland's place in the UK be secure, but Scotland could also look forward to a more powerful future as part of a stronger United Kingdom. 2014 is what scholars sometimes call a constitutional moment, a time of choice and a time of change. And the choice, as I said, is two different visions for Scotland's future. One is what I think is a narrow inward-looking vision, in which we sever the political connections between us and the rest of the United Kingdom, in which we go it alone on the basis of a set of negative arguments and implausible evidence driven by a distorted view of Scotland's identity and its history. The alternative is a positive vision to opt once again into a wider multinational relationship with the nations of the United Kingdom, benefiting from shared strength and stability. We're proud to run our own affairs and make our own choices. I know which is the right choice, and the right choice for Scotland. It's the choice to look outward and not inward. It's a choice to share and not to stand separate. It's a choice of economic strength, not financial uncertainty. It's a choice of stability and security, not the risk of weakness that would come from separation. In the end, it is the Scottish choice, the choice of a nation which is international and not narrowly national. A nation which believes in social solidarity, not narrow self-interest. A nation that will choose proudly to remain part of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed.